The war had ended, Japan had surrendered, and still, in the interior of Brazil, men were receiving letters ordering them to kill themselves for admitting it. Around them, fake Japanese language newspapers claimed the empire had won. Radios had been confiscated, real news had been cut off, and inside the largest Japanese immigrant community outside Japan, denial was beginning to turn into murder. This is the story of Shindō Renmei, and of the moment World War II refused to end in Latin America. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The Second World War was over, Japan had surrendered, the emperor had spoken, cities lay in ruins, and still in the interior of Brazil, some men opened letters telling them to die with honor for saying exactly that out loud. Around them, fake Japanese language newspapers circulated, claiming the empire had won. In places where radios had been confiscated and trusted information had been cut off for years, those lies did not feel absurd to everyone. They felt like the last shelter left. What followed was one of the strangest afterlives of the war anywhere in the world, and one of the least remembered in Latin America. In Brazil, home to the largest Japanese immigrant population outside Japan, a radical ultranationalist movement called Shindō Renmei turned denial into discipline and discipline into murder. Between 1946 and 1947, more than 20 people were killed. Well over 100 were attacked or marked for death, and Brazilian police arrested more than 1,200 suspects trying to tear the network apart. This story did not begin with fanaticism. It began with migration. In 1908, the ship Kasato Maru arrived in Brazil, carrying Japanese contract laborers recruited mainly for São Paulo's coffee economy. Over the next few decades, migration deepened, and Brazil became the principal destination for Japanese immigrants. By 1940, the country held the largest Japanese population outside Japan. By then, this was no passing enclave. It was a rooted presence in Brazilian life. The first generation entered a hard world. Plantation labor was punishing, contracts were often bitterly unequal, and many immigrants arrived with hopes that reality quickly reduced. But people stayed, moved, married, bought land where they could, and built something more durable than the recruitment agents had promised. Agricultural colonies expanded. Small businesses appeared. Mutual aid associations formed. Japanese language schools and newspapers connected scattered settlements to one another and to the homeland they still imagined, remembered, or hoped to see one day again. By the 1930s and early 1940s, many of these communities were concentrated in São Paulo state and parts of Paraná, often in rural zones where distance had its own politics. Some immigrants learned Portuguese and navigated Brazilian institutions with relative ease. Many first-generation settlers did not. Some families remained tightly tied to Japanese language associations, newspapers, and schools. Their world was not outside Brazil, but neither was it simply absorbed into Brazilian public life. It had its own rhythms, its own loyalties, its own horizon of meaning. Then the war closed in. When Getulio Vargas brought Brazil firmly into the Allied camp in 1942, Japanese immigrants came under heavy suspicion along with other Axis-linked communities. The state banned Japanese language newspapers, shut schools and associations, restricted travel, prohibited public use of the language, and confiscated radios and communications equipment. These were measures of surveillance and national security. Still, within immigrant life, they also served as blows to memory, habit, and everyday trust. The result was not only repression, it was disorientation. In agricultural colonies where many older immigrants spoke little Portuguese, the closure of Japanese language media created a brutal vacuum. Contact with Japan was cut. News moved slowly, then badly, then hardly at all. The state that now claimed to defend truth had already silenced the channels through which this community had made sense of the world. In that kind of atmosphere, rumor does not arrive as a sideshow. It begins to do the work that institutions no longer can. So when Japan surrendered in August 1945, the news did not reach all of Brazil at the same time. It came broken, delayed, filtered through hostile authorities, in fragments of translation, by word of mouth, and through wounded pride. For many immigrants, especially those formed by pre-war imperial education, the idea itself was nearly unbearable. They had been taught loyalty to the emperor as absolute. They had been taught that Japan could not truly yield. For people who had endured years of humiliation abroad, the news of defeat could sound less like truth than like one more insult. There was another wound inside it. Many immigrants had once believed they might return to Japan, if not immediately, then someday. Even those who had no practical path back often kept the homeland as a moral anchor, the place that justified sacrifice and made exile meaningful. To accept defeat was to admit not only that the empire had collapsed, but that the symbolic center of their lives had been shattered. The war's end did not settle a military question alone. It threatened an entire emotional order. Inside the Japanese community in Brazil, that pressure hardened into a split. Those who believed Japan had won, or refused to accept that it had lost, came to be known as the Kachigumi, the victory faction. Those who accepted the surrender became the Makegumi, the defeated faction. On paper, the terms look almost tidy. In daily life, they were not. They ran through farms, cooperatives, neighborhood associations, stores, friendships, and households. Once the line was drawn, even ordinary conversation could begin to feel like a test of loyalty. Out of that wartime world, and sharpened by defeat, Shindō Renmei became the most dangerous organization inside the Victory Believer camp. The organization took shape in 1945 in São Paulo state and is generally associated with Junji Kikawa, a former Japanese army officer who settled in Brazil. It did not operate like a formal army, and historians differ on some points of its internal structure, but the broad outline is clear. This was a semi-clandestine nationalist movement, strongest in rural colonies, built around loyalty to the emperor and the insistence that Japan had not truly been defeated. Its core claims were simple, absolute, and corrosive. Japan had won. Reports of surrender were American propaganda. The emperor could not genuinely capitulate. Those who repeated talk of defeat were traitors spreading poison among loyal subjects. Later research also points to rituals of loyalty, informal internal judgments, and a language of punishment that turned political disagreement into moral contamination. Once that logic settled in, evidence from outside became almost irrelevant. Truth belonged to the faithful. Doubt belonged to the corrupt. To keep that world alive, Shindō Renmei and allied victory believers built what historians describe as a parallel information system. Forged Japanese language newspapers circulated through the colonies presented as genuine publications from the homeland. False communiques claimed Japanese victories across Asia, the collapse of Allied forces, and even American surrender. Some texts were framed as imperial or military communications. Others moved orally, through traveling activists and trusted intermediaries, reaching coffee zones, settlements, and community gatherings where people were hungry for anything that sounded certain. Some of the claims now sound impossible. There were stories that the atomic bombings were a hoax, stories that Tokyo had outmaneuvered the United States, stories that Allied reports were psychological warfare meant to break Japanese morale abroad. In some colonies, later accounts speak of gatherings that treated Japan's supposed victory as fact. There was even a rumor that a member of the imperial family would come to Brazil and confirm what loyalists already knew. None of that was true, but truth was not the only force at work. The propaganda worked because it fit the wound. Many first-generation immigrants trusted Japanese-speaking community figures more than Brazilian officials who had censored them for years. Many had no easy way to verify what they were hearing. Many had been educated in a system in which the emperor's authority was sacred, and many simply did not know how to live inside the fact of defeat. One historian would later describe the whole episode as among the 20th century's most extraordinary cases of collective self-deception. Extraordinary, yes, but also terribly human. Once that alternate reality hardened, the Makegumi were no longer just wrong. They became dangerous. Defeatists were accused of betraying the emperor, disgracing Japan, and polluting the community with enemy lies. According to police findings and later historical reconstruction, targets were identified through reports from sympathizers, then judged within local networks that treated punishment as a righteous duty. The term tenchu, divine punishment, appears in accounts of the movement's moral language. The message was clear enough. To tell the truth about the war was to mark yourself for judgment. The first stage was often a letter. A man would receive a written warning accusing him of dishonor and demanding that he restore that honor through suicide, sometimes in the language of seppuku. If he refused, the matter did not end. A small team could be sent after him. The attackers were sometimes described in sources through the symbolic language of toko or special attack units, borrowing the prestige of wartime sacrifice. In practice, they were usually small cells of young militants moving between settlements with pistols or knives. The pattern soon repeated often enough for fear to become a method. A target was named. A warning arrived. He was told that death by his own hand could cleanse the insult. If he refused, assassins would come to finish the sentence for him. They came to homes, farms, roads, and gathering places. Some killings happened in front of wives or children. Some victims knew the men who attacked them. The battlefield was gone. What remained was a disciplined intimacy, a terror campaign carried out inside the same community that had raised its dead together. Among the earliest victims commonly identified in police records and later historical accounts was Hiroshi Saito. a prominent community figure in São Paulo state, who had publicly acknowledged Japan's defeat. He reportedly received letters ordering him to die for dishonoring the emperor. When he did not comply, he was shot. In later reconstructions, other names appear as the campaign widened. Men such as Shigeru Taniguchi and Mitsugi Watanabe, marked as defeatists after speaking openly about surrender or sharing Brazilian newspaper reports with neighbors. The names matter because they keep the story human. These men were not abstract examples in an argument about propaganda. They were farmers, merchants, newspaper readers, cooperative figures, local voices trying to tell others what had happened to Japan and what it meant. Some urged adaptation to Brazilian life. Some simply refused to repeat a lie. In the moral universe of Shindō Renmei, that was enough. To read the news aloud could be treated as treason. To insist that the war was over could become a capital offense. Most of the victims fit a similar profile. They were often better integrated into Brazilian society, more likely to read Portuguese, and more willing to accept the surrender and move on. That did not make them powerful. It made them exposed. In an isolated colony, the person who could explain the outside world might also be the first one accused of serving it. The killings turned practical knowledge into suspicion. They made ordinary acts of interpretation feel dangerous. A newspaper, in that climate, could begin to resemble a weapon. The scale of the violence was small compared with the war that had preceded it, but that is not the right measure. Historians generally concur on 23 confirmed murders, with more than 140 attempted killings or assaults, alongside hundreds of threats and intimidation incidents. Most occurred in Japanese agricultural areas of São Paulo state, with some spillover into nearby regions. The numbers are modest only if one forgets what they represent: a campaign of political execution within a single immigrant community, after the war itself had already ended. The fear inside those colonies was deep and ordinary. People learned to watch what they said, whom they corrected, what newspaper they carried, and what they admitted in public. Families of victims, sympathizers, doubters, and true believers lived in the same towns and traveled the same roads. Community associations became fragile ground. A storekeeper might not know whether the man entering his shop came as a customer, a messenger, or a judge. That is how terror works when it does not need to occupy a whole country to rule a neighborhood. Outside the colonies, Brazilian authorities were slow to grasp what they were looking at. Early murders could be dismissed as personal disputes or obscure quarrels inside an immigrant world that many officials neither understood nor trusted. Brazilian newspapers often portrayed the crisis as ethnic fanaticism in miniature, which was not entirely false but also not enough. The killings were not random eruptions. As investigators collected letters, testimony, and physical evidence, they began to see the shape of a coordinated purge. The repeated structure gave it away. Victims had received similar warnings. Names recurred across settlements. Propaganda materials turned up in connection with attacks. Raids and interrogations uncovered membership networks, clandestine communications, forged publications, and operational links between local militants and ideological organizers. Police concluded that the murders were not isolated vendettas, but part of a broader campaign to discipline the Japanese community from within. In effect, a private war had been declared over who had the authority to define reality. What investigators found next made the crisis look even more dangerous. During raids across São Paulo's Japanese colonies, police seized notebooks, letters, lists of names, propaganda sheets, and records interpreted as future target lists. Most of the named people were defeatists, community leaders, merchants, cooperative figures, or others accused of spreading traitorous news. Historians have treated some of these discoveries carefully because the archive is uneven. But even with that caution, the picture is severe. The killings already committed were likely not meant to be the last. This is the point where some police officials began to fear something larger than assassination. They did not uncover evidence of a foreign-directed plot or a Japanese government operation. Later studies are clear on that, but they did see a rural network with propaganda channels, armed cells, ideological discipline, and a population large enough to make the situation volatile if the killings continued. Some investigators feared the community was moving toward a much broader internal conflict, perhaps even a chain of retaliations that would be much harder to contain. The state answered with force. São Paulo police launched raids across agricultural colonies, gathering places, suspected printing operations, and the homes of organizers. More than 1,200 people were arrested. Some estimates run higher. Weapons were seized. Propaganda stocks were confiscated. Communication lines were broken. Junji Kakawa was arrested. Once the scale of the operation widened, Shindō Renmei could no longer move with the same confidence between settlements. The very geography that had sheltered it now became a map for its dismantling. The trials that followed were less clean than the arrests. Several assassination teams were prosecuted, and convictions for murder could bring sentences of 20 to 30 years. But many cases were difficult to prove. Witnesses hesitated. Some feared retaliation. Others did not want to expose the community further. Language barriers slowed proceedings and made testimony harder to pin down. Hundreds were detained. Far fewer could be tied directly to a specific killing. The courtroom could not reproduce the certainty with which the movement had issued its own sentences. Even where convictions were secured, the legal aftermath did not end in some simple vision of permanent punishment. Later accounts note sentence reductions, releases, and in some cases, deportations. By the early 50s, many participants were no longer imprisoned. That did not erase what had happened. It changed the aftermath's form. Families of the dead, families of the convicted, and families of those who had sympathized without acting still had to inhabit the same social world. The prison gates did not carry the burden away. At almost the same time that police were breaking the movement's structure, another pressure was eroding its inner world. In 1946, Japanese language news and recognition group bulletins began reaching the colonies again. By early 1947, the open publication of Japanese language newspapers had resumed in São Paulo. Verified reports from Japan began reaching readers who could now encounter news in a language they trusted. Surrender, occupation, ruined cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Emperor's broadcast. The return of print did not convince everyone immediately. Still, it damaged the closed system that had sustained the fantasy of victory. Reality was no longer arriving only through enemies. For many victory believers, that was a devastating moment. Some abandoned the belief quickly. Others tried to hold two incompatible worlds together a little longer. A hardcore kept denying the obvious. Even after photographs of destruction circulated and Japan's condition became plain, that stubbornness is part of what makes the episode so unsettling. This was never just a shortage of facts. It was a crisis of identity. If your dignity, memory, and moral life have been tied to a fiction, truth can feel like annihilation. By 1947, the movement had collapsed as an organized force. The murders stopped. The cells were broken. The target list no longer functioned as sentences awaiting execution. Moderate leaders within the Japanese Brazilian community worked to restore a measure of order and distance themselves from the extremists. Most Japanese Brazilians rejected the violent ideology that had consumed the Shindō Renmei militants. Publicly, life moved forward, but private life was slower. It carried the residue of accusation, shame, grief, and fear. For decades, the episode became taboo. Part of the silence came from the horror of the killings themselves. Part came from embarrassment at how far the movement had gone. Part came from a very practical concern. Public discussion could feed anti-Japanese prejudice in a country that had already treated this community as suspect during the war. So memory folded inward. Victims' relatives and perpetrators' relatives often remained in the same towns. Children grew up near people whose names they were not told. Silence became a local custom. That silence is one reason the story still feels hidden, even though it exposes something essential about Latin America in the 20th century. This was not an eccentric footnote to European or Asian history. It happened in Brazilian coffee country, under Brazilian wartime policy, inside immigrant settlements that were already part of the social fabric of the nation. The debris of empire did not stop at oceans. It crossed into plantations, schools, police offices, neighborhood associations, and family life. The war reached Brazil not only through diplomacy, but through intimacy. It also reveals how fragile reality can become when a state first censors a community, then expects that community to trust whatever remains. Information isolation did not by itself create Shindō Renmei. Still, it helped build the room in which the movement could breathe. Humiliation did the rest. A people cut off from language, pressed by suspicion, and told that their world has collapsed may cling to whoever offers them honor rather than uncertainty. When that offer comes with forged evidence and moral absolutes, belief can harden into doctrine. There is nothing romantic in that. The men who organized and carried out these murders were responsible for what they did. The lie did not pull the trigger on its own. At the same time, contempt is too easy, and history deserves better than easy. What happened in Brazil grew out of migration, race, censorship, isolation, empire, and the long psychological debris of war. That is why the story still matters. It shows how ordinary people under pressure can begin to inhabit a reality built from injury, obedience, and fear. And the dead should stay at the center of it. Men were marked for divine punishment for telling neighbors the emperor had surrendered. Men were ordered to kill themselves for speaking the truth. Men were shot for reading newspapers, for urging calm, for refusing to bow to a fiction. Their lives remind us that reality is not defended only by governments, scholars, or armies. Sometimes it is defended by a shopkeeper, a farmer, a local organizer, or a man who says something unbearable and correct at the wrong season. World wars do not end all at once. They end in capitals, then in headlines, then in law, and then, somewhere much later, inside human beings. In Brazil, the war lingered in the distance between a ruined homeland and an isolated colony, between a censored language and a forged newspaper, between humiliation and belief. When it finally loosened its grip, it left graves, court files, and decades of silence. That silence is part of the history, too. It is what remains when a community survives something it can barely bear to name. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.